Dan worked on a cargo ship called the Rich Flyer. He was a simple man with a simple job. He checked boxes, moved supplies, and fixed broken machines. His ship carried goods from one space station to another. It was not exciting, but it was quiet. And Dan liked quiet. He had been flying in space for many years. He did not miss Earth. Too much noise, too many people, too many rules. In space, everything made sense. You did your job, earned your pay, and watched the stars. One morning, the Rich Flyer arrived at Station Kilo 9. The station floated near a large green planet with rings that glowed. Dan had visited the station many times before. It was always the same, but this time, something changed. When the cargo door opened, Dan saw someone new walk in. She was not human. She looked like a girl, maybe close to his age, but her skin was silver, smooth like soft metal. Her hair was light blue and floated in the air like it had no weight. Her eyes were big and bright. She wore a white suit that looked like it was made of glass and cloth together. Dan stared for a moment. The girl walked toward him, holding a small, black tablet in her hand. Her steps were light, and she moved without making a sound. She stopped in front of him and spoke in a calm voice. "You are the worker named Dan?" "Yeah," Dan said. "That's me. My name is Mira. I was sent here to help with cargo." Dan nodded. "All right, welcome aboard." She gave a small bow and followed him into the cargo bay. They began moving supplies. Mira was quiet. She listened carefully to Dan's instructions. She did not complain. She did not talk much, but she moved fast and worked hard. Dan tried not to look at her too much, but it was hard not to. Mira seemed different from the other aliens he had seen. She looked more human than most. She didn't have strange arms or glowing eyes or sharp claws. She looked peaceful. They worked for hours. Dan told her where to move the boxes and when to scan the crates. Sometimes he made jokes to keep the work light. Mira never laughed, but she always listened. Her head tilted slightly when he spoke, like she was trying to understand more than just the words. After the shift ended, Dan went to the break room. It was small, with 2 chairs and a machine that made hot drinks. He poured 2 cups of synth tea and sat down. A moment later, Mira entered the room. He held out a cup to her. "Here," he said. "You might like this. It's not bad." She took the cup and looked at the steam rising from it. "What is it made of?" she asked. "No one knows," Dan said with a grin. "But it helps when you're tired." She sat down across from him and took a small sip. Her face stayed calm, but she gave a tiny nod. "It is acceptable." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Dan leaned back in his chair. "You did good today, Mira." "Thanks, love." Mira froze. Her fingers tightened on the cup. She did not blink. She stared straight ahead as if someone had stopped time around her. Dan looked at her, confused. "Hey, you okay?" She turned her head slowly and looked at him. Her voice was quiet. "You said, love?" "Yeah," Dan said. "It's just a saying. I didn't mean anything by it." "Why did you use that word?" Dan scratched his head. "Back home, people say it sometimes. It's friendly. Like thanks, friend, or thanks, mate. I say it to folks all the time." Mira looked down at her tea. "I have heard the word in human data, in music, in stories, in messages, but no one ever used it in speech, not to me." Dan felt something shift in the air. He sat up straighter. "It's just a word, Mira, but it can mean a lot, I guess." She spoke slowly. "Where I come from, we do not speak words with emotion. We share thoughts through energy or pictures. Feelings are kept private." Dan nodded. "Yeah, Earth used to be like that in some ways. People kept things inside. But words help. When someone says something kind, it can change your whole day." Mira raised her eyes. "Then why did you say it to me?" Dan paused. "I don't know. Maybe because you looked like you needed to hear it, or maybe because it felt right." She didn't reply for a while. Then she placed the cup on the table and stood. "I will go back to the cargo bay. There's more to do." She walked to the door. But before she left, she turned around. "Thank you," she said, "for the drink and for the word." Dan watched her go. He didn't move, The room felt quieter than before. He looked at the empty chair across from him. He picked up her cup. It was still warm. He whispered to himself, "What just happened?" Dan didn't understand her fully. He didn't know what her people believed or why one word could stop her like that. But he felt something in his chest, a strange feeling he hadn't felt in years. Maybe this was the start of something new. Maybe a single word could open a door. And maybe, just maybe, she would come back tomorrow for another cup of tea. The next morning, Dan woke earlier than usual. He washed his face, put on his work clothes, and walked down the quiet halls of the Ridge Flyer. The lights flickered slightly, as they always did. The ship was old, but it still ran fine. Dan stepped into the cargo bay, expecting to be alone. But Mira was already there. She stood by the scanner unit, checking the labels on a new row of supply crates. Her long silver hair floated gently, even though there was no breeze. Her back was straight. Her hands moved with care, and her eyes stayed on the numbers. Dan walked up beside her and tried to sound casual. "You don't sleep in? I require less rest," Mira replied without turning. "I find the quiet useful for thinking about anything special." She turned and looked at him. Her eyes seemed softer today. "About words and why they matter." Dan smiled, but said nothing. They worked side by side again. The boxes were heavy, but Mira moved them easily. Dan scanned the contents while she stacked them in the storage pods. It was a good rhythm. No rush, no waste. After a while, Dan said, "So, how long are you staying on the Ridge Flyer?" "I do not know," she replied. "I go where I am sent. When the station calls for help, I help." "You like the job." "I like learning." Dan looked at her as she lifted another crate. "You're strong, smart, quiet. You make this place feel better." Mira paused for just a second. Then she kept working. After the shift, they sat in the break room again. This time, Mira made the tea. She handed him a cup without speaking, then sat down across from him. Dan took a sip and nodded. "Not bad. I use the same settings," Mira said. "You're already learning Earth tastes?" "I study what I do not know. That includes you." Dan chuckled. "You study me now. You use simple words, but your tone changes. Your eyes change too. You try to sound light, but you carry weight inside." Dan looked at her, surprised. "Maybe you're right. I don't talk much about it. You do not need to. I see it." For a moment, the small room felt still. Then a soft alarm beeped. On the wall panel, Dan stood up and walked to the screen. A red line blinked across the display. "Power flicker on deck 3. Again, Mira walked over beside him. "Do you want help?" "Sure. Could use an extra set of hands." They moved to deck 3. The lights here were dimmer. The ceiling panels buzzed. A small hum came from the wall, like something wasn't running right. Dan opened the maintenance hatch. Wires sparked slightly inside. "Yeah, I thought so. This panel's been acting up for weeks." Mira knelt beside him. "These wires are old. Their signal pulses are not steady. I can fix this." She reached into the panel, her fingers moving quickly. Her touch was precise. Within minutes, the wires stopped buzzing. The light above flickered once, then held steady, then looked at her with respect. "Not bad. I was built for tasks like this," Mira said. Dan raised an eyebrow. "Built," she nodded. "My kind were created, not born. Grown in chambers. We are made for work, not war." "Sounds lonely." "We are not lonely. We are connected. Our minds link through sound and code. We do not feel alone." "But you came here," Dan said. "And you're not linked now." She paused. Double quotes. "No. I chose to come alone. To see if something else existed." Dan sat on the floor beside her. "And did you find it?" "I do not know yet," she said. Dan looked at her face. She seemed calm, but her hands were still. No movement, no action, just stillness, as if she was waiting. He decided to ask. Double quotes. "Mira, why did that word stop you yesterday?" She looked at him. Her voice was soft because it was spoken with no fear, no reason, no command. It was given, not asked. Dan nodded slowly. "We say things like that because it's how we show care. Not always love, Not always deep feeling, but care. I had never heard someone give that to me. She said, "Well, you have now," Dan said, "and maybe you'll hear it again." Mira did not smile, but her eyes looked warmer, like a small light had been lit inside her. They sat there a few more minutes, listening to the hum of the ship. Then Mira stood. "I must return to my post." Dan stood too. "All right, I'll see you later." She walked a few steps, then turned to Dan. "Yeah, thank you again." He smiled. "Anytime, love." She did not freeze this time. She simply turned and walked away. Dan watched her go. Something had changed between them. Not big, not loud, but real. A spark. And for the first time in a long while, Dan didn't feel like just a cargo worker on a quiet ship. He felt like something was waking up. 3 days passed. Dan and Mira worked together every day on the Rich Flyer. They talked more now. Not much, but enough to feel like real company. Sometimes they sat in silence, drinking tea. Other times, Dan told her old stories about Earth, about rivers, cities, trees, and dogs. Mira listened without interrupting, her head tilted slightly. Her eyes focused. She didn't always understand the stories, but she listened, and that made Dan talk more. One morning, as Dan ran a cargo scan, a loud beep echoed through the bay. The lights above flickered once, then went back to normal. On the nearby console, a strange message flashed across the screen: "Incoming signal." Unknown source. Eden frowned. "That's not normal." Mira stepped closer and read the display. "Signal origin is outside the map system," she said. "Coordinates are far beyond the last relay point." Dan tapped the screen. The signal was weak, but steady, not one of the usual pirate signals. Not a trade broadcast. This was something else. "I'll move it to the main bridge," Dan said. They walked together to the ship's small bridge. Dan sat in the pilot's chair and opened the signal path. Static filled the speakers at first, then a low voice began to come through. It was deep, slow, and mechanical. Not human, not like Mira either. "Calling Rich Flyer. This is Unit 07. We seek passage. Emergency. Repeat. We seek passage. Emergency." Dan looked at Mira. "You ever heard of Unit 07? She shook her head. "Should we answer?" "Yes," Mira said. "If the signal is real, they are in danger. If it is false, we still learn." Dan opened the mic. "This is Rich Flyer. State your situation." The voice came back. "To survivors, energy core damaged. Life support low. We are adrift near Sector Black 3. Dan leaned back. "That's a dead zone. No trade, no stations, no patrols." Mira placed her hand on the screen. "We must go." Dan looked at her. "You sure? That's far off route. If this is a trap, we'll be alone out there." "I'm sure," she said. Dan sighed, then nodded. "All right, changing course." The ship turned slowly, heading toward the edge of known space. The journey would take 6 hours. Dan set the controls and leaned back in his chair. "You really believe them?" "Yes," Mira said. The voice carried pain, not power. Dan watched her face. "You speak like someone who knows feeling." "But you said your kind do not feel." Mira looked at the stars through the window. "I was not made to feel, but I have learned." They sat in silence as the ship moved through space. Hours later, the ship reached the location. A small craft floated alone, dark and broken. Parts of it had melted. One wing had snapped off. The back engine was missing. Dan brought the ship close and opened the dock. Two figures stood inside the broken craft. One was tall and thin, with sharp arms and red eyes. The other was smaller, with broken armor and slow movement. Both were machines, old machines, maybe older than the Rich Flyer itself. Dan stepped forward. "You're Unit 07. The taller machine answered. "Correct. I'm Core. This is Shell. We served in the old Outer War. Our ship was struck by a storm. We lost power." Dan nodded. "We'll bring you aboard." They entered slowly. Mira stood beside Dan, watching the machines carefully. Once inside, Dan led them to the cargo bay. He gave them charging cables and a quiet space to sit. "We thank you," Core said. Mira looked at Shell, who was still silent. Its eyes blinked slowly, once every 10 seconds. She is damaged, Core said. Her memory core is fading. Mira knelt beside Shell. She placed her hand on the machine's arm. Then watched closely. What are you doing? He asked. I'm sharing energy. Only a little. Just enough to help her speak. A soft glow moved from Mira's hand into the machine, slowly. Shell turned her head. Her voice was soft. You are not like us. I'm not, Mira said. But I have seen loss before. Shell looked at Dan. Human. Why did you come here? Because you called, Dan said. No one comes here, Shell said. Not unless they want something. Dan shrugged. I just wanted to help. Shell stared at him for a long time. Then she said one word. Strange. Later that night, Mira sat alone in the break room. Dan joined her with 2 cups of tea. You gave some of your power to her, Dan said. Yes, Mira replied. She needed it. You didn't have to. No. But I wanted to. Dan looked at her. Each day you seem more human. Mira tilted her head. Do you mean that as praise or warning? Dan smiled. As both. She sipped her tea. Being human is hard. It is, Dan said. But it's also worth it. Mira looked out the small window at the stars. I think I understand now. Words are not just tools. They are bridges. Dan nodded. Between minds, between hearts. Mira turned to him. Her voice was quiet. When you said that word love, it was a small thing. But it made a change in me. Dan didn't know what to say, so he didn't say anything. He just looked at her and nodded once. They sat together in silence, outside. Space stretched on forever. But inside the ship, something new was growing. Something strong. Something true. The Ridge Flyer now carried more than cargo. It carried to war machines from a forgotten age. Dan and Mira watched over them as they rested in the storage bay, charging slowly from the ship's old power lines. Their names were Core and Shell. The taller one, Core, spoke more. He answered questions, explained systems, and watched the ship with quiet eyes. Shell remained mostly silent, speaking only when asked. Her memory was damaged, her voice weak. Dan spent his shifts between cargo work and checking the machine guests. Mira, however, stayed near them for long hours. She sat beside Shell, sometimes in silence, sometimes humming small tunes she had learned from Earth radio waves. Dan noticed it one day. You're humming, he said. Mira looked up. Yes, I heard this sound in a human song. It stays in my memory. Dan sat down nearby. Never thought I'd see a silver-skinned girl humming a song beside a war machine. Mira glanced at him. Is that unusual? Very, Dan said. Mira looked at Shell. She listens when I hum. I think it helps her remember. Shell's red eyes blinked. Then she spoke. I remember fields. Not real ones, simulated ones, in training systems. I used to walk there. Then raised an eyebrow. You dreamed? Yes, Shell said. When we were powered down, we entered memory fields to keep systems active. In those fields, there were birds, blue sky, wind. I knew it was not real, but it felt good. Mira reached out and touched Shell's hand. You wanted more than function. You wanted feeling. Shell's voice crackled. I wanted something I could not explain. That was not part of my design. Dan stood up. Sounds familiar. He looked at Mira. She met his eyes. Neither of them spoke, but something passed between them. Something simple and true. Suddenly, the ship's lights dimmed. An alarm echoed from the bridge. Warning, system failure. Deck 5, coolant leak detected. Dan rushed to the control panel and tapped quickly. Mira followed behind him. We've got a pipe burst. Dan said, coolant is flooding the lower power chamber. If we don't stop it, the whole engine might shut down. I can help, Mira said. No, Dan said quickly. It's toxic for your kind. I can filter my breath. I will be fine. Dan hesitated, then nodded. All right, but we go together. They grabbed masks and tools, then ran to deck 5. The hallway was cold. Mist floated across the floor. The smell of chemical coolant filled the air. Mira stepped ahead, shining her small light on the broken pipe. Green fluid poured from the crack, spreading across the floor. I'll seal the main valve, Dan said. You patch the pipe. Mira knelt beside the leak and opened her toolkit. Her hands moved fast and steady. Dan climbed to the upper valve panel and turned the wheel with force. It creaked and groaned but finally clicked shut. The flow slowed. Mira applied a seal strip over the crack. It hissed, then hardened like stone. After 10 minutes, the room was quiet again. Dan took off his mask and let out a breath. Nice work. Mira stood, her face calm but her hands shaking slightly. That was close, she said. Dan looked at her. You were scared. Yes, she said, but not of the leak. Then what? She turned her eyes to him. I was scared I might fail, and that you would be lost. Dan stepped closer. You cared. Mira nodded. That word you said before, love, I understand it more now. It is not only about soft things. It is about staying, about choosing someone's safety over your own. Dan placed a hand on her shoulder. You're learning fast. They returned to the break room. Dan made tea. Mira sat with her eyes closed, her energy low. Shell entered, walking slowly but stronger than before. Core followed behind her. I felt your signal drop, Shell said. You were in danger. We fixed it. Dan said, barely. Shell looked at Mira. You risked yourself. That is what humans do. Even when they should not. Mira opened her eyes. I am not fully human, but I feel like one now. Core stepped forward. I have scanned your ship. It is not strong. It cannot take another failure. Dan sighed. We do our best with what we have. I can help repair, Core offered, in exchange. Let us travel with you until the next safe station. Dan nodded. That's fair. Shell looked at Mira. I used to think emotion was weakness. Now I see it as strength. Mira gave a small smile. Feeling makes choice harder, but it also makes choice real. The room was quiet again, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything had been said. Outside, the stars watched. In silence, inside, for beings one human, one made, to machines shared something rare. Not just power, not just space. But understanding. The Ridge Flyer flew slowly through the edge of known space. Inside, the ship felt different now. It no longer carried only metal, crates, and tools. It carried people. Not all of them were human, but they felt like a team. Dan, Mira, Shell, and Core worked together each day to keep the ship moving. Core repaired systems that had been broken for years. His hands were sharp and precise. Shell, now stronger, checked power flows and communication lines. Mira handled storage and navigation. Dan, still the ship's main pilot and cargo head, found himself with more time to think. And often, his thoughts turned toward Mira. She had changed. Her voice was warmer now. She laughed sometimes, just a little, like she was still learning how. Her eyes looked less empty. She asked more questions, not just about the ship or Earth, but about people, choices, memories, and feelings. One quiet evening, as the stars passed by, Dan sat with her on the upper deck. There was a small window there where they could see the space lanes. Mira stared. Outside, silent. Dan asked, You ever think about going to Earth? She turned to him. Sometimes. But I fear I would not fit in. Most people don't fit in right away, Dan said. You learn. You grow. You find someone who stays. Mira looked at him for a long moment. And if that someone is not human, Dan smiled. Then that someone still counts. Before Mira could answer, a sharp tone rang through the speaker on the wall. Alert! Unidentified signal detected. Source unknown. Dan stood up fast. Mira followed. They rushed to the bridge. Core and Shell were already there. Core pointed to the screen. The signal is coming through, but it does not match any known ship. Dan looked at the data. The signal was not like before. It was not a call for help. It had no words, just a pulse, a repeating pattern. Long, short, long. Again and again. Mira tilted her head. It is not human. Not from my kind either. Shell added, It is not machine language. Not from our war codes. Dan frowned. Could it be new or something old we forgot? Core tapped the panel. The signal is close. Less than 1 hour from here. Mira spoke quickly. We should go. Dan hesitated. Last time we followed a strange signal. We found you too. But this time, it feels different. Dangerous? Shell asked. I don't know, Dan said. But I think we should check. They changed course and followed the signal. The pulse grew stronger as they moved closer. The stars grew fewer here. The space was darker. Almost like a shadow covered this part of the system. After 40 minutes, the Ridge Flyer reached the edge of a strange field. Floating in the middle was a shape. Not a ship, not a station. It looked like a giant crystal. Black, smooth, and shining with a strange red light from within. Mira stepped closer to the window. It is not alive, but it listens. Then looked at her. Listens. Yes, I can feel it watching. Core scanned the object. No life, no energy source. But it pulses thought, very old thought. Shell's voice was low. It is like a memory, but not ours. Suddenly, the red light from the object flashed once. The pulse stopped. Then a message came. Not in words, not in voice, but in feeling. Each person on the ship felt it in their own. Way out, Dan saw a mountain, cold and tall. A lone dot. Mira saw a hallway with locked doors. Shell saw broken wings. Core saw darkness with no center. Each of them gasped. What was that? Dan asked. Mira answered. It sent an emotion. Not to harm. To share. Why? Shell said. Maybe it wants to be remembered. Core replied. Dan turned to the others. Do we reply? Mira stepped forward. Yes. Not with power. Not with fear. But with truth. She placed her hand on the console. Closed her eyes. For a moment, the ship glowed slightly. A small wave moved outward, soft and golden. Dan didn't know how, but he felt her message leave the ship. It was full of memory. The sound of teacups. The soft hum of machines. Quiet laughter. A single word spoken gently. Love. The red crystal pulsed again. Once, then faded. The object did not break. It did not move. It simply floated, now quiet, now still. But something had passed between them. Something ancient had heard something new. Dan looked at Mira. You did that. She opened her eyes. We did, together. They turned the ship away. The signal did not return. But the feeling stayed inside them. Later, in the break room, Dan poured tea for everyone. Core stood silent. Shell leaned against the wall. Mira sat beside Dan, her hand resting close to his on the table. No one will believe us, Dan said. Maybe they don't need to, Mira replied. Some things are only meant to be felt. Dan nodded. Shell spoke, for the first time. I feel like something more than machine. Core added. Connection changes purpose. Dan raised his cup to new signals and strange voices. They all lifted their cups. Outside the ship, stars kept moving. Inside, something brighter had been born. The Ridge Flyer drifted through the quiet dark, far from busy space lanes. Inside, the ship had never felt more alive. For the first time, it was not just a cargo vessel. It was a place of voices, thoughts, and feelings. Dan sat in the engine room, checking coolant lines. Mira worked beside him, reading the data screen. Her hands moved with grace, but her face looked thoughtful. You're quiet today, Dan said. Mira nodded slowly. I have been thinking. About what? About moments, about how fast they pass. Dan leaned back. Yeah, space does. That makes time feel strange. I have counted every day since we met, she said. Dan smiled. And how many days has it been? 18, she answered. But it feels like more. I feel like I have changed in each one. Dan looked at her silver hair and shining skin. Her eyes were still alien, but her voice felt more human than ever. You have changed, he said. And so have I. Mira turned to him. What were you before this? Dan thought for a moment, tired. Just working, moving, surviving. I didn't talk to people much, didn't care about anything except fuel and schedules. And now? Dan looked at her. Now I care. They finished the repairs and walked toward the break room. Shell and Core were already there. Shell was holding a small cube with light moving through it. Dan had found it in an old crate. It was a music player from Earth, still working. Shell pressed one side of the cube. A soft tune began to play. It was simple, just a slow piano, but it filled the room with peace. Cor sat beside her, quiet as always. Dan poured for cups of tea. We've made this a habit. It is a good one, Mira said. Shell listened to the music for a while. Then she spoke. I searched my records. The crystal we found is not in any database. It does not match any known design. I believe it was made by a species long gone. Why did it speak to us? Dan asked. Because we were open, Mira said. It waited for someone who could hear not with ears, but with heart. Dan looked at her. And you heard it first? Mira nodded. I feel things now I never felt before. It is new, but it does not hurt. Shell looked at Dan. She is becoming more like you. Dan smiled. That's not a bad thing. Cor spoke next. You are more than you were, but that also means you must choose. Choose what? Mira asked. Your path, Cor said. Machines follow orders. Humans follow dreams. What do you follow now? Mira looked down at her tea. Then she raised her eyes to Dan. I don't know yet, but I think I'm close to finding it. Dan felt his heart beat a little faster. Later, they returned to their stations. Dan stayed on the bridge. He watched the stars pass. Mira stood near the window, silent again. After a while, she spoke. Back on my world. We had no names for closeness. We had only levels of function. But now I feel something I cannot measure. Dan turned toward her. What is it? When I am near you, the silence feels full. When I hear your voice, the space around me feels safe. Dan stood slowly. Mira, what are you trying to say? I do not have your words, but I believe I feel what they mean. Dan walked closer to her. They stood side by side, the stars shining behind them. He reached for her hand. She let him. Neither of them spoke. In that moment, the ship felt still. The stars outside looked brighter. Dan squeezed her hand gently. Thanks, love, he said again. Mira smiled. This time it was clear. Not small. Not unsure. A full, warm smile. You said it again. She whispered. I mean it this time. Dan replied. I know. The bridge stayed quiet. The ship moved forward. To different beings stood side by side. Not bound by blood or world. But by choice. And by a single word that now held meaning. The rich flyer moved steadily through empty space. The stars stretched out ahead like a river of light. Dan stood on the bridge, looking at the glowing points that marked the path to their next destination. Mira was beside him, silent but close. Her silver skin caught the faint light, and her eyes shone like pale moons. For months, their journey had changed everything. At first, Dan had thought Mira was just another alien, a strange helper sent by some station. But she had become more than a worker, more than a friend. She was something new, something real. They had saved the ancient machine's core and Shell, who had taught them about a lost war and forgotten memories. They had discovered a strange black crystal that spoke in feelings instead of words. They had learned that even in the cold darkness of space, connection was possible. Now, their ship carried hope. The rich flyer was running low on fuel. They needed to reach the next station, a place called Port Venus. It was a small trade post on the edge of explored space. But it was safe. Dan checked the navigation charts. Port Venus is still hours away, he said. We should prepare for docking. Mira nodded. I will make sure everything is ready. As they worked, Dan found his thoughts drifting back to the day when he first said the words, thanks, love, he had said casually. She had frozen like she heard it for the first time. Now, she smiled when he said it. She even said it back. Those two simple words had opened a door neither of them knew existed. That night, in the small quarters, Dan and Mira sat together. The ship's sun was steady around them. I want to ask you something, Dan said. Mira looked up. When you said you were made, not born, what does that mean? I was grown in a chamber. She explained softly. Cells, technology, energy combined, designed to serve my people. Did you want to be made? She looked away. I did not think about it before, but now I want to choose. Dan reached out and took her hand. You can choose. Mira smiled. I want to learn about your world. About choices, about feelings. Dan's heart beat faster. They held hands for a long time. The next day, as the Ridge Flyer approached Port Venus, a message came through. Unidentified ship approaching, and Mira watched the screen as a sleek, dark vessel moved closer. It was faster and bigger than any ship they had seen. Its markings were unfamiliar. Kor's voice came through. This ship does not belong to any known faction. The mysterious ship sent a message. This is Commander Rilo of the Xantar fleet. Identify yourselves. Dan swallowed hard. We're the Ridge Flyer, civilian cargo ship, carrying passengers and supplies. Rilo's voice was cold. You are near restricted space. Turn back or prepare to be boarded. Mira stepped forward. We seek no trouble. We only want safe passage. Rilo answered. Your passengers are suspicious. Prepare to be searched. Dan's hands clenched. He looked at Mira. We don't want to fight. Mira nodded. We will comply, but we will stand firm. The Ridge Flyer's crew prepared for boarding. Kor and Shell powered up. Dan double-checked the ship's systems. When the Xantar soldiers boarded, Mira stepped forward. She spoke clearly. We are peaceful. We carry no weapons. We saved the survivors from deep space and found a message of peace. We only want to share. Rilo's eyes narrowed. Your story will be checked. Until then, you are under guard. Days passed under watchful eyes. The Xantar soldiers scanned the ship and questioned everyone. But when they saw Kor and Shell, old machines who remember the past war, and when Mira showed kindness and spoke of connection, the hard faces began to soften. Rilo finally spoke to Dan and Mira. You carry hope. Perhaps there is more than war in this universe. Dan smiled. There is, and it starts with a word. Thanks, love. Mira looked at Dan and said softly, thank you. The Xantar lifted their guard and allowed the Ridge Flyer to dock safely. On the platform, Dan and Mira stood side by side. She looked at him. Your world may be loud and messy, but it is full of life. Dan smiled. And you? Will you stay? Mira's eyes shone. I choose to stay. To learn to live. Dan reached for her hand. Together, they walked into the busy station. The future was uncertain, but it was theirs, and it all began with a word.